So, hello and welcome everyone. Firstly, I should thank Erfan for arranging this meeting despite having very busy days. And I should thank all of you for being here, and especially Graham, Jon, and Niki. Years ago, when I was an undergraduate student, I an email to Graham and asked him to send me the PDF versions of a number of his books because I couldn't download them online and couldn't buy them either because due to sanctions. In the end of that email, I have written this. I hope I could someday compensate your favor by sending my own books to you for free or even dedicate them to you. He was kind enough to send me those books, which made me a fan of him ever since. And now I dedicate this meeting and also will dedicate my next translation, which is a series of Lovecraft stories, to him. This project, this OOP project, or Object-Oriented Psychology, started when I wrote a series of ideas about what a future school of psychology, that is object-oriented psychology, would be like. And Harman read it, mentioned some points, and encouraged me to work on it. I have to admit that not much of a progress has been made compared to the initial outline that I sent to Graham. But in the meantime, I'm working with my friend Leila Asukri, who is from Morocco and focuses on interdisciplinary studies, on writing a paper in which details will be further described. So, what is object-oriented psychology all about? It is a theory or a school in psychology based on Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, or OOO. So, this is an application of OOO in psychology and not philosophy per se. And as I said, this is just a very basic idea or outline of what an object-oriented psychology would look like in the future. So this is psychology in the making. For this reason, everything could look crude and raw now, but I shall work on it and make it look better. And this meeting would serve as an opportunity to get feedbacks from you so I can revise things later, so every feedback is appreciated. Also, since my Iranian psychologist friends might not be that much acquainted with object-oriented ontology, I suggest them to read my translations of 2 Graham Harman articles, 76 thesis on object-oriented ontology, and objects, matter, sleep, and death. So, and by the way, I have a very long name. My name is Frouzesh Nia. You can simply call me Iman, as many other people do. And yeah, I should apologize again for my English. So let's get started with my slides. Let me present here. Okay. Is it visible now?
Yeah, you can see it.
Okay. So, I shall start with a critique of modern psychology in terms of its anthropocentrism. As a sub-branch of modern science with its anthropocentric worldview, modern psychology too is deeply anthropocentric. Modern psychology, just as modern science in general, is about and for human. Even when it tries to overcome the framework of humanistic individualism, for example, in social psychology or ecological theory in psychology, this discipline merely overcomes individualism, but it still considers the social or ecology as essentially human. Likewise, when psychology talks about objects, for example, in object relations theory, these objects that interact with the individual are always taken to be human figures. This anthropocentrism gets so overwhelming that a group of existential theorists like Viktor Frankl, following some existentialist philosophers, claim that that humans give their own meanings to the world. So the world is depicted merely as a raw material using which humans shape his own meaning. However, since these theorists are living in a world in which God and metaphysics are dead, this meaning, far from being universal and inclusive, is merely partial and subjective, which inevitably leads to some kind of postmodern subjectivism. In other words, in existential psychology, human is not thrown in the world, but stands outside the world and, just like a god, gives meaning to it. Similarly, whenever Freud looks upon non-human objects, he views them merely as a foundation or screen for subjective projection, for example, in fetishism. For Freud, too, the world is human and non-human objects are raw material. Also, when it comes to application, since modern psychology is for human, it is merely concentrated on human and human society's well-being. Now I will turn to a critique of modern psychology in terms of it being reductionist. In modern psychology, theories of personality, in modern psychology's theories of personality, three reductionist approaches are detectable. In the one hand, behaviorist approaches tend to reduce human personality to external expressions and environment, which is overmining. And in the other hand, psychodynamic, cognitive, existential, humanistic, Gestalt, and other similar approaches tend to reduce personality to unconscious elements, internal thought patterns, beliefs, instincts, will, etc., which is undermining. Also, there are traits of personality theory that reduce personality to a number of traits. For example, introvert or extrovert. But since these traits are atomistical and lack any potential to interact with each other, some theorists of these schools feel obliged to enter some dynamic elements into their theories. For example, the concept of erg in Raymond Cattell. This will make their theories even more dynamic-like and hence even more undermining-oriented. And then finally, there is also a third trend, including the popular cognitive behaviorist theory and also social learning theory, which reduce personality both to internal and external factors, which is dual mining. So, in all of the mentioned theories, personality is reserved for humans only. And human personality is regarded as something essentially knowable, and various questionnaires and tests are developed for that purpose. Now I will move to my discussion about an object-oriented psychology, which will try to go beyond the modern psychology in terms of being non-anthropocentric and non-reductionist. In his book titled Discognition, Stephen Shaviro, drawing on Whiteheadian philosophy, writes about a number of interesting mechanisms of navigation, learning, decision-making, trial and error, etc., in microscopic organisms and artificial intelligence, extending the concept of agency and subjectivity and introducing sentience as an umbrella term for the way through which these beings relate to the world. Shaviro extends our understanding of the psyche. Drawing on such examples and adopting a polypsychist worldview, OOP will be dedicated to observing and analyzing all types of the non-human psyches. So far, modern psychology has used non-human species merely as instruments for experiments in order to generalize a number of their mental functions to human beings and reach a better understanding of the human psyche. On the contrary, OOP, or object-oriented psychology, will try to observe non-human psyches in their radical otherness. Going further than non-human species, OOP will also include non-human organisms such as plants in its studies. And going even further than organic species, OP will also study non-organic psyches. In Discognition, Shaviro writes about the epistemology of robots, artificial intelligence, and different types of embodiments, such as video games. Also, in a blog post, Levi Bryant writes about how we can regard Google as some sort of collective unconscious for humans. Also, Fritz Leiber, in his novella, The Black Gondolier, ascribes some sort of agency and psyche to oil. And Andy Clark, in his book, The Extended Mind, explains the role that external objects play in mental functions. OP will be able to provide a ground based on which all these subjects could be addressed and studied. In an article titled Objects, Matter, Sleep, and Death, Graham Harman writes, I quote, "The panpsychist view, namely, is that anything that exists must also perceive. But the view I have suggested is that anything that relates must perceive. Entities have psyches accidentally rather than in their own right, for our model allows for entities to exist apart from all relations." End of the quote. Harman calls this view polypsychism. Now, affirming polypsychism in OOP would imply that the psyche is not omnipresent, not only among all beings, but also not only for humans at all times, but is accidental and is created with every instance of relating. This view puts us against the whole current of modern psychology and also gives us a tool to build a new theory of personality, which now I will try to explain, an object-oriented theory of personality. If we regard psyche as a whole as an object, in the sense understood in OOO, then we shall inevitably confirm its irreducibility to external factors, internal ones, or a combination of the two. Therefore, psyche, which has personality as one component, is ultimately unknowable. Hence, and unlike other modern theories of personality, OOP does not explain personality as an a priori and knowable structure. Graham Harman, in his book Bruno Latour, Resembling the Political, explains how Latour views modern political philosophy as resulting from two basic terms, which are truth politics and power politics, or politics of truth and politics of power. Politics of truth claim that they know the essence of the human and the essence of the politics. For example, the class struggle. While the politics of power claim that the truth in politics is shaped by the powerful, for example, in Hobbes, Machiavelli, Schmidt, etc. As Latour notes, what these two groups share is a claim of knowledge about the essence of politics, be it truth or power. Against this traditional view, Latour introduces an object-oriented political theory, which is not an a priori structure whose essence is already known, but rather is constantly changing network which is constituted around various public objects, for example, climate change. However, Harman notes that the politics is not reducible to these objects, but because it is an object itself. Now, the same dichotomy is seen in psychology. In the one hand, there are trait theories that claim to know the essence of personality through a number of traits. I call them psychologies of truth. And in the other hand, there are dynamic theories who believe in the primacy of drives and desire and will in shaping the personality, and I call them psychologies of power. Now, if we apply this theory of personality, we might begin to see the personality not as an a priori and knowable structure, but rather as a formation constantly shaping itself around different objects. But these shapings or formations are intermittent. In the absence of an encountering object, this structure withdraws into itself and becomes what Harman calls a dormant object. But if personality was supposed to form around an object and then completely vanish, there would be no memory, there would be no identity, and there would be no learning. So, traces of previous formations remain in the psyche even when it is dormant. This gives us memory, this gives us identity and learning. And also, we can also explain reflection in such terms. An act of reflection is translating a relation or a formation, a previous formation around an object, into an object itself, into a new object. And then the psyche can form around this new object and relate to it again. This gives us a reflection. This is also how a therapist would encounter the patient as he would encounter the patient as a part of an object, which includes the patient in relation to one or many other objects. So we do not encounter the patient alone in psychology. Now, every new formation, as I said, is to some extent affected by previous one, but not totally. This places us against psychodynamic theories, among others, because if the structure of personality is each time formed around object, then this implies that the original state of psyche is a form of withdrawal. Instead of there being a primary and basic structure called id in psychoanalysis. So all forms of relating, and hence all forms of formations which result from them are on the same footage, because it is object that determines them. Also, unlike Freud and object relations theories, these objects with which the psyche encounters are no longer only human figures, but are all objects in their various shapes and ontological differences. This is a picture of how this happens. Its psyche is formed around an object, but not the object itself, but the qualities of the object, which makes an experience. So we will go to a developmental theory, an object-oriented developmental theory, to see how these formations change through development. An object-oriented developmental theory will trace a process that I call objectification among all objects. This objectification is expressed in two forms. In the first form, we see it as an evolution in various kinds of objects. And in the second form, we see this in human development. So the process of objectification passes through 4 stages. This is also the process of evolution and process of human development. At the first stage, we merely have a formation. A formation is made, the psyche, the personality is formed around an object. This is what we witness in inorganic objects and also in human babies in early stages of development. At the second stage of organization, this early formation itself gets objectified, and a second order formation is formed around this new object. This is the level of reflection, memory, and sign. Here we have living organisms and children in a higher stage of development. Now this goes on. At the third stage, all of these second stage formations, that is, all of reflections and memories and past relations to object, get integrated into a new object itself. It is objectified into a new object. This is where we get the idea of identity as something constituted by past relations, but standing above them and being irreducible to them. Here we can place higher order organisms and also human beings in the early adolescence, the stage of development. Here the object is able to reflect on its own being as separated from all accidental formations, and hence affirm its own withdrawal as an independent and irreducible object. This is the root of self-love, which comes with identity. So now at the fourth stage and the highest stage of objectification, an object reflects or forms around again its own identity as a separate and withdrawn object, and view it as only one identity or one object among many other objects. each of them being irreducible to their relations and being fully independent and withdrawn. So my identity is only one identity among many others. This highest level of objectification is a stage reaching to which is only possible for human beings. And I would like to call this stage ontological love. Later, I will explain what exactly do I mean by calling this as ontological love. So, in short, 4 stages of development are formation, reflection, identity, and ontological love. Here, I should add that we can take sociality as a step toward this final stage, because it is in sociality that we encounter ourselves as only one identity among many other equal identities. Now, I should look at a object-oriented social psychology and see what can this look like. Social psychology attempts to overcome the fundamental individualism in psychology. But this attempt is performed within the limits of the modern notion of anthropocentrism. For modern social psychology, society is still a human society. Making use of Latour's actor network theory, we can view society as a larger network, including humans and non-human actors. Hence, with inquiring about the various interactions between psyches and multiple other actors in a network, OOP will be able to extend and enrich social psychology. Meanwhile, it should be noted that an individual is irreducible to society and vice versa. Here I will look at psychopathology in terms of OOP. Now, if we accept the formation of, if we accept that the formation of personality and the process of development are formed around objects, an object is what determines them, then it follows that any interruption in an individual's normal and healthy relation to objects might lead to mental disorders. A healthy psychological functioning then can be viewed as being among other objects and relating with them without any tendency toward transgressing the limits of object withdrawal and independence, which is a basic characteristic of all objects. Now, the healthiest form of relating style is expressed in what I call love. For Freud, love is essentially narcissistic and is all about trying to cover some lack or deficiency. But if we take the approach of OOP, love becomes an encounter with an object not necessarily human, in which the radical independence and withdrawal of the object of love is not only affirmed but also appreciated. This view of love reminds me of a part of a lyrics by my favorite singer, Leonard Cohen, who sings, "I loved your moods, I loved the way they threatened every single day." Here, the beloved is taken to be a part of a network of relations from which she always tends to break free. and revealed something new. And this is what is loved by the lover. And since this formation of the psyche, which embodies the sense of identity, is always a formation around an object, then in love we become something completely new. This concept is similar to a poem by some Arab poet, in a part of which he writes, "Who was I before I fall in love with you?" This is also close to the Kantian notion of aesthetics, which Schopenhauer also develops further, according to which in our encounter with the work of art, we do not try to comprehend it or grasp it or use it somehow. Rather, the free play of faculties encountering the essential indifference of the artwork is what produces our admiration. This is also similar to the views of Max Scheler about love. For him, love, instead of itself being a cognitive content, is a way of attending things. He writes, I quote, "True love opens our spiritual eyes to ever higher values in the objects loved. Hatred, on the other hand, is the closing off of oneself or closing one's eyes to the world of values." End of the quote. We can also think about two general forms of love, which are individual and ontological love. In individual love, a loving formation is formed around one or a number of objects. But in ontological love, this love-oriented formation is formed around all objects equally. And this ontological love is similar to what we see in Buddhist literature. But we should note that in ontological love, it is not the case that all objects are our mind and reduced to some all-inclusive objects called being, or God, or nature, or other things. But it is rather not reducing any objects to anything else, affirming their withdrawal, and also loving oneself, that is, affirming one's own withdrawal, and not seeking a sort of dissolution and fusing into the object of love. This view of love is also reflected in a brilliant Zen koan writing by Qingyuan Weishin of 9th century, which goes like this. First, there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. The first view reduces the mountain to its current qualities and relations for me. The second view reduces the mountain to the tiny particles out of which it was made. The third mountain, which reminds us of Harman's third table, is neither of the two. It is the independent mountain, irreducible to any forms of reduction and grasp of cognition. So this is what I mean by ontological love. Now, therefore, in love, we form around the object without trying to capture it, grasp it, destroy it, or becoming exhausted in it. As much as this view is similar to aesthetics, it is far from the modern scientific approach. Modern science tries to capture the object through three forms of reduction, which are undermining, overmining, and dual mining. But in love, the ultimate unknowability of the object of love is admired. In science, a surprise is nothing but an irregularity that should be explained away, because the destination is to fully know or grasp the object of experiment. But in love, as OOP sees it, and in aesthetics alike, a surprise is an allure from the ungraspable depth of the object, which hints to its ultimate unknowability. Now, the healthy relation, when interrupted, the healthy relation, which is basically a relation which is love-oriented, when interrupted, leads to unhealthy relations, which in psychology are called mental disorders. As an example, we can explain obsession as a form of relating or formation that essentially resembles the scientific approach of trying to capture or exhaust the object. But since the object in itself always remains unknown and withdrawn, then this failure of exhausting the essence of the object produces distress, which in turn leads to further attempts by the obsessed person. To the contrary, in anxiety, there is an expectation of being exhausted by the other object, which results in a defensive formation. Likewise, we can think of depression as an inability to form a meaningful relation to object and withdrawing. For a depressed person, the world is flat. Everything is totally exhausted in its current relations. There is no change and no beyond. This leads to boredom because no surprise or nothing new ever happens. Then this path gradually leads to depression and pathologically withdrawing. In social psychology too, we can detect similar pathological strategies of relating. At least three are basic strategies of relating. Love, which is affirming the withdrawal of the object, is the healthy way of relating to objects. And ontological love, which is the affirming of withdrawal of all objects, is the healthiest love. And we have then exhaustion, trying to undermine our mind or domain objects, and we have pathological withdrawal. Now, in psychology, we can detect similar pathological strategies of relating. A person might try to capture or exhaust a society, which will result in an authoritative attitude. Another person might be willing to exhaust one's self in the mass or in the society, which leads to obedience, following the leader without question, or just following others. And yet another person might feel the threat of being exhausted by social relations and find solace in withdrawing from them, which is pathological withdrawal. Now, if we go to an object-oriented psychotherapy, as we saw in previous examples, two basic strategies of pathological relating or formation are exhaustion of self and other objects, and withdrawal and pathological withdrawal. They are called pathological because they are all various means of reducing objects and trying to undermine them. But since these pathological strategies finally encounter the ontological dead end of object withdrawal, they fail. And this failure will be expressed in distress and mental disorders. We should pay attention to the difference between the pathological withdrawal and the original and fundamental withdrawal of all objects. Because the pathological withdrawal takes place only after an initial encounter with an object, and hence is a defensive formation. Therefore, it's actually a fake withdrawal because it is actually a form of formation itself. That's why the depressed person often feels sad due to his withdrawal. Sadness is itself a formation. So he's not totally withdrawn. Now let me go back here. In this picture, we see three fundamental strategies of relating, two pathological and one healthy. Every way of relating can be somewhere on this diagram. Our daily modes of relating can be a combination of the three, but excessive divergence or tendency toward one of the two pathological strategies may lead to disorders. Here I should add that I'm currently working on developing a total set of mental disorders based on all triple O terms, which are based on these actually. So, let's continue. Therefore, object-oriented psychotherapy will try to analyze an individual's relation to various objects, inquire and assess the personality's formations around these objects, recognize possible disturbances in the formations based on two basic disruptions previously mentioned, and help the individual to regulate these relations in a more balanced way. And restructure or reform her structure of personality in a healthier way, which is a move toward more love, actually. Here, the role that the psychotherapist will play regarding a human patient will be vastly different from other types of psychotherapists. In OP, the psychotherapist will not try to provide a new meaning or insight or logic. Rather, psychotherapists will try to show how the patient's usual way of relating to other objects has been based on various kinds of reductions, and then he'll try to help them see how this strategy has failed, because objects are essentially irreducible to any relations whatsoever. This is how in OOP the psychotherapist will be looking like Socrates. This is so because Socrates too, in his dialogues, tries to show that the interlocutor how his knowledge of the world was always reductionist and not comprehensive, and that direct knowledge of the world is impossible. And there is no surprise why he calls his method philosophia, which means a love of wisdom, because Socrates knew what a love-oriented encounter with the world would imply. This very approach may be undertaken by an OOP therapist, which is moving the patient away from futile attempts uselessly done to exhaust other objects or himself, to pathologically withdraw toward a more love-based way of being, which affirms the total and essential inexhaustibility of all objects. Previously, in psychotherapy, we had a Socratic method devised by Aaron T. Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy. But Socrates of Beck looks more like a sophist. In his Socratic method of therapy, the therapist discovers the ineffective thought patterns of the patient, which are biased, and teaches him the correct or the effective pattern of thought, which is based on reason. It is supposed that reason has a direct access to the world. But for Socrates of OOP, or the therapist of OOP, there is no direct access, and all relations are indirect translations. And this is what the patient should understand, knowing that they can't know. Therefore, object-oriented psychotherapy will try to analyze an individual's relations to various objects. I'm sorry, I think I read this. Also, since object-oriented psychotherapy does not dedicate itself to being about and for human, then its application can be extended to non-human objects too. Now, I will ask myself some questions, and then I answer to myself. So, if a question may arise that isn't OP basically unconscious in new clothes somehow, because of its focus on withdrawal and how objects is withdrawn and stuff? No, because the concept of unconscious, despite its novelty and radicality, I think, it still remains reductionist and anthropocentric. But why exactly is it a reductionist? Because it is dependent on the process of consciousness. That is, it includes suppressed parts of consciousness. Therefore, it does not lay outside of experience. Accessing it is possible in an indirect way through therapists' insight-oriented partnership. Essentially, the whole psychoanalytic therapy is built upon the unconsciousness accessibility. Unconsciousness is a scientific and empirical concept, and not a transcendental one. It is a part of our relatedness to the world. Interpretation of dreams and free association, among others, are Freud's innovative and empirical means to gain access to the unconscious and making it conscious. Therefore, unconsciousness is reducible to consciousness, given that it is a residue of consciousness, and also in the sense that it is empirically accessed through the consciousness of the therapist. Also, this concept is reductionist in the sense that the totality of personality is reduced to it, to the unconsciousness. Meanwhile, the psyche in OP is not reducible to any internal or external objects. Also, the unconscious is omnipresent and registers everything. But the psyche in OOP is not omnipresent. It is dormant until an object is encountered and a relation is established. On the other hand, as already mentioned, psychoanalysis is deeply anthropocentric. Love of objects for Freud equals to a disorder. Because for him, objects are only symbolically meaningful in the sense that they represent humans. So in short, while unconscious is ultimately accessible and omnipresent, the psyche in the OOP sense is ultimately inaccessible and accidentally present. Now, the next question may arise that isn't OOP a new form of psychologism? Like we are trying to explain everything through psychology. Firstly, not all objects are always related. And furthermore, some objects never into any relations. So, if the psyche is formed upon relating, we must admit that there are many objects and many instances of being which psychology is unable to study because there is no psyche there. Secondly, each science studies the relations between objects according to a specific framework. For example, physics studies the relation between objects according to a framework of force and movement, and OOP studies them from the perspective of psyche. So in short, OOP does not reduce all relations between objects to psychology, because psyche is not omnipresent, and also because if all sciences are on the same footage, they all somehow distort reality or art translations of reality, then we can't prioritize one kind of science to another because it supposedly goes deeper. Now, another question. How does OOP explain need and motivation? Because if we start by objects, we might have problem with explaining need and motivation and stuff. Now, if we believe in the primacy of relation or formation with objects in the formation of the psyche or personality itself, then need can't be the most desire or need can't be the most fundamental building blocks of the psyche, as we have in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, desire is a primordial force which attaches itself to various objects, petit a in Lacanian terms. But if we begin with objects, then we can reverse this order and claim that it is the encounter with the object that results in a formation through which a desire for the object is produced. So, also need can be established as an object to which we relate or we encounter as a felt sense and form around it as a new object. When we talk about objects, these objects shouldn't be understood as just physical or external objects, but every thought or emotion is as well some kind of object. So around which we can form. So need can be also a form of objects around which we form. And need also can be a relation or a formation around another object. The fourth question is, now let me, before that, let me also explain how we can talk about motivation in OOP terms. In psychoanalysis, desire is primary, and this primary desire creates attention. So motivation in psychoanalysis is a response to this tension. It is an attempt to satisfy the need. But if relation with objects and not need is taken to be primary, or if relations with objects or not desire in psychoanalytic terms is taken to be primary, then motivation is a reaction to the object. An object appears and psyche is forced to form and react. The felt sense of this force is experienced as motivation. So the fourth question is a bit political. So we talked about how love is the healthiest way of relating. Now the question may arise that should we also love our oppressor or oppressors in political terms or even individual terms? Now the oppressor is someone who does not affirm my own withdrawal and my own unknowability. For an oppressor, I'm exhausted in my usability for them. Now, if I want to love my oppressor as someone who wants to exhaust me, that would be another psychological, pathological strategy, which is exhausting the self in the object of love. This is pathology. In genuine love, when I affirm the withdrawal and its non-penetrable boundaries of the object of love, this boundary between me and them makes me aware of my own boundaries as well. And hence, I affirm my own withdrawal as a distinct identity. So every love, every genuine love in OOP terms is also a self-love. And there is no self-love in loving the oppressor's exhaustion of me. So that would be actually pathological. Rather, at the same time that I resist the oppressor's urge to exhaust me or desire to exhaust me, I can love them as being more than this current act of oppression, which is affirming their radical withdrawal and unknowability, and not being completely exhausted in current relations. So I can still affirm their withdrawal and love the fact that they can change. So this is how I can love an oppressor. Now the last question, and I will end this probably boring lecture. How does OP explain death? How does or explain our relation to death? Death itself, for an object, is not an object around which it would form. I cannot form around death itself. And I cannot relate to death itself. What an object relates to is the idea of death. Now, in humans, in case of having ontological love, if a human has ontological love, that is the fourth level of objectification, ontological love towards all beings, a person is able to confirm the fact that other objects are independent of me, and therefore, in case of my death, they will continue to be there. So, but if there is no such love, since the radical otherness of other objects is not affirmed, and their withdrawal is not affirmed, then my death will be correlated to the death of the world, which is determined with its relation to me. Therefore, my death will be catastrophic. This is clearly visible in some schizophrenic patients. For them, the imminent disintegration of their own psyche is literally experienced as the imminency of the end of the world as a whole. Because the schizophrenic is so enmeshed with the world, so exhausted in the world, or sees himself, his identity as exhausted in the world, that the existence of the world without the existence of himself becomes unimaginable. So I'm getting disintegrated, transforms into the world is getting disintegrated, or the world is going to end. Hence, maybe we could call the schizophrenic patient a correlationist par excellence. The Messiah complex among many schizophrenic patients is also explainable in this framework. Messiah complex is a form of delusion in which an individual holds the belief that they are destined to become a savior of the world. Now, this saving the world could be explained as an attempt to save the individual himself, who is seen as the constructor of the world. And now, Georg Buchner, in his brilliant play entitled Wojciech, brightly depicts this aspect of schizophrenia. For Wojciech, his own mental decline, or the idea of his own end, gets translated into the imminent end of the world. Then Wojciech tries to save the world by sacrificing his immoral wife, who is supposedly guilty of this doom. Now, Now, another thing is that how does the idea of death stems from? How this idea of death is approached? How I form around this idea of death? It is in my encounter with my object of love that I become aware of my own death. Because it is in such an encounter where, affirming the withdrawal and boundaries of the object of love, I become aware of my own temporal and spatial finitude. I come to consider myself as a limited and finite object in space and time, as an object that dies. If now I'm not there in place of the object of love, and if I'm not them, then there will be a time that I will be nowhere and no one. This is in this very possibility of dying that I affirm myself as an independent object. And I objectify myself above all my relations, because I can break free from all these relations in death. So I'm not determined by these relations because I can die. So I die, therefore I'm irreducible to all these relations. So thank you for your time and patience and being there. Here I end my boring lecture.
Thank you so much, Iman. Thanks for your amazing presentation. And thanks to everyone for listening to us. Graham, if you want to join in, maybe comment on what Iman just said, and also talk about your ideas about maybe this new idea of like this new path in OOO. I cannot. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Iman. It's great to see you for the first time after all these text communications over the years.
That's actually the very first time that we all are seeing Iman, because nobody has seen it before, including me and Sami Alamati. He's like a Batman, Batman of psychology.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right, this mysterious underground figure.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, you're reminding me of the time I sent you those PDFs, which I have done for people in Iran and Cuba and some other countries where there is difficulty. Reminds me of something that's not as well known as it should be in Europe and North America, which is that Iran is one of the great speculative countries, like Germany, if you go back historically. And so to be going through the world as philosophers without Iran as part of our lives is like stumbling through the world without one arm or something. And so I hope this situation changes at some point, one way or another, because I would love Iran to be part of our travel circuit and to have more active intellectual exchanges with people in Iran. And incidentally, your English was fine. I think we all understood every word. So there's nothing to worry about there.
Thank you.
You'll have no problem speaking to any audience in English. I'm also pleased to see in how much detail you've worked this out. I didn't realize how far along this path you were. And of course, I agree with a large part of what you say in this lecture. One thing, if I were going to make any suggestion, it would be that maybe you want to build more psychoanalysis into this, since that's probably what many people are going to be expecting to hear about when they're hearing about philosophy and psychology. I mean, there's obviously all other kinds of psychology, and psychoanalysis is often excluded as being somehow unscientific. I'll talk about that in a minute. But that's what a lot of philosophy-minded people might want to hear more about in your theory. You alluded to Lacan's objet art, and also to object relations theory, which, as you rightly point out, that's Melanie Klein. Even though she's supposedly talking about objects, all the objects turn out to be the mother's body. And so it's, in a way, it's not really about objects. It's about the all-powerful, encompassing character of the mother, which I have a lot of respect for Klein. There's a lot to be said in her theory, but it's not really an object-oriented theory, despite the term object relations theory. So, yeah, and I'm also pleased that you brought in Shaviro's Discognition, which is another book that really got me thinking a lot. And your thoughts on death, your thoughts on narcissism, all of these were very interesting to me. You also had a slide that you didn't talk much about, but I wrote some notes about this last night, which was, isn't object-oriented ontology just another kind of psychologism? And I'm not sure who would say that unless it was someone who was calling us a panpsychist and therefore claiming that we're putting psychology everywhere and therefore we're a psychologism. Jon and Niki are organizing a discussion on panpsychism, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the result of that will be. I'll be involved in that, and so will Philip Goff, the analytic philosopher who's also a panpsychist. And it's funny, panpsychism is bigger in analytic philosophy now than it is in continental philosophy, which you would never expect. Panpsychism in continental philosophy will get you branded as a crackpot much faster than it will in analytic philosophy. I think because continental philosophy is still basically transcendental philosophy. It's all about the human relations of the world, and you can't really speculate beyond that. It's still kind of a Kantian discourse in continental philosophy, even in Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. Anyway, to go to what I have in my notes, I wanted to speak briefly about psychologism, briefly about psychoanalysis, and briefly also about the human-animal divide. And Jon's about to walk off screen here. I was going to say, one of the reasons I want to keep this brief is because Jon is making a heroic appearance here under unpleasant health conditions. And so I thank him for being here, and I don't want to make him listen to me too long. Of course, psychologism, the famous foe of Psychologism is Edmund Husserl. He has a huge prolegomena to his logical investigations, which are an attack on psychologism. And when you read his account of these psychologistic approaches to logic, they're certainly bad. People are saying things like, that logic is really just a set of psychological laws. I'm trying really hard to think that A is not A, but I'm trying really hard and I just can't do it. My brain isn't wired to be able to think that A is not A. And as Husserl rightly points out, that's an absurd approach to logic. That logic is an attempt to talk about something that has validity quite apart from the laws of how the mind works. Now, paradoxically, the only way he can fight psychologism is by embracing idealism. Because in order to justify the validity of these logical laws, he has to claim that we have direct access to these laws and can see that laws are valid independent of how our psychology works. And so ironically, he ends up having to say that he has a position that's what's often called direct realism, that we have a direct access to reality. But direct realism is, in my view, a form of idealism because it assumes that the world is isomorphic with the mind and that there's no translation or distortion going on between the two. So I think I think Husserl never really recovers from his idealism. I've written about why he's still a great philosopher anyway, because even within this idealistic framework, he draws an important distinction between objects and their qualities, which is basically the anti-Humean distinction. And I think he's the first person ever to do that fully in the history of philosophy. Kant gets at it a little bit with his transcendental object equals X. That's ultimately a Humean theory, just like Badiou's theory of objects is ultimately a Humean theory. It's based on a bundle of qualities model. Whereas Husserl gets us beyond the idea of objects as bundles of qualities because objects can sustain many different qualities and still be the same object. Yes, Aristotle already did that with the substance-accident distinction, but Aristotle's talking about reality. Husserl's the first one to do that for the purely phenomenal worlds. So, psychologism is one thing we want to avoid when we're talking about object-oriented psychology, for sure, and that requires some kind of presence of a reality, which incidentally, I don't think Lacan gets with his concept of the real, because the real in Lacan is really, it's not a real, it's like a stumbling block, it's like a trauma. It's not realism, it's traumatism. The real is what cannot be, it's an impasse of formalization. It cannot be formalized. It cannot be mathematized. But there's nothing about object-object relations in Lacan. And I'll get into psychoanalysis next. In fact, I'll do that right now. The status of psychoanalysis in philosophy. Recently, I was reading Etienne Gilson's The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, and I read it simply because I passed it at random on the library shelf. And I said, I've been meaning to read that. It's not related to anything I'm working on, so it's a chance encounter with this book, and I read it. And what's interesting about that book, of course, Gilson is a committed Catholic, which many philosophers are not. Many philosophers are not religious in our time. But he points out that even if you're not religious, the fact that people like Augustine and Aristotle were Christians enabled them to see things in Plato and Aristotle that the rest of us could not. The revelation, the Christian revelation, even if you don't accept it, did open up these thinkers onto a completely different meaning of what Greek philosophy was about, and it enabled them to develop. These were great philosophers, people like Aquinas and Scotus, Bonaventure and Albertus Magnus. These were great philosophers, even if you disagree with their religious views. Something about that revelation gave them the ability to see something in the world. At the risk of angering some people, I think Marxism is similar in the sense that I don't think Marx can a priori prove to all readers that he is correct. I don't think just reading Marx is enough to say, oh, profit is evil. Profit is actually surplus value and it's exploitation. You need a kind of conversion experience to think that. I've never had that reading Marx. Obviously I see there are a lot of abuses in capitalism, but I've never gotten to the point of saying profit is in itself evil. That it's somehow taking something from somebody else and giving it to yourself. It's just never quite clicked with me. But Marxism has enabled some very great philosophical insight on the part of many people, much like Christianity did in the Middle Ages. And so if Marxism can make you into better philosophy, great, as far as I'm concerned. And that brings me to psychoanalysis, which I think is a similar sort of thing. Because many people can look at psychoanalysis and say, oh, it's not scientific. All right, but I have had a kind of conversion experience with psychoanalysis. When I read Freud and Klein and Lacan and other authors such as this, I think that something is going on there that is true. And I don't care if people say that it's unscientific. There's something that you could never prove a priori that there's an unconscious. This comes out of Freud's clinical experience and his interpretation of dreams. It's a non-philosophical motivator to possible philosophical developments, because once you agree that there's an unconscious, philosophy looks a lot different. And some of the great philosophers of the early 20th century, whether you're talking about Husserl, Heidegger, Whitehead, Bergson, the great analytic thinkers, psychoanalysis isn't really present in these thinkers. It might as well not exist for these people. The way that Christianity might not as well exist for these people. Or that Marxism might as well not exist for Heidegger or Husserl. So where do we find psychoanalysis in philosophy? I think people are neglecting something about Zizek, which is that he's really the first philosopher of that stature to build psychoanalysis into the heart of his position. I mean, there's Lacan, but Lacan's not really a philosopher in our sense. Even Badiou calls him an anti-philosopher. So really, Zizek is the first one to do this. And I think Zizek is going to be remembered as a more significant figure than a lot of people think. I have my differences with him, but this idea that he's just a clown, or that he's somehow just the B team for Badiou, who's the real systematic thinker, I think these are mistakes. I think the breakthrough to psychoanalysis in philosophy, we owe a lot of that to Zizek, and I think he's going to be remembered that way. What is the unconscious? Just speak here briefly. Again, Zizek gives us a nice definition. Some of you know Zizek's little piece on Donald Rumsfeld. If you remember Donald Rumsfeld, the American Defense Secretary during the Iraq War, talked about how there are known knowns, things that we know. There are known unknowns, like we don't know where Saddam is hiding his weapons of mass destruction. Turned out there probably weren't any. And then there's the unknown unknowns, things that we don't know and don't realize that we don't know. And Zizek makes this funny point that the reason Rumsfeld isn't really a philosopher is that he misses the fourth term, the unknown knowns. There are things that we know that we don't realize we know. And he says that's the unconscious. And he links it to Kant, right? That what's Kant really about? Kant's about the fact that for all these years we've been going around governed by our intuitions of space and time and the 12 categories of understanding. And until Kant came along, we didn't realize that because those things were too obvious. And so that's his definition of the unconscious, and I think it's a pretty good one. Unknown knowns. Just to give a couple of examples that Zizek takes from Lacan and other such sources. The man whose wife dies and keeps her wedding ring on a necklace around his neck, on a chain around his neck, and he's remarkably calm about his wife's death, to the point that people are wondering if he's really sad that she died. He's just incredibly calm about it. But then about 5 years later, he loses that ring, and he has a total mental breakdown, which Zizek interprets as a form of fetishism. That, right, yes, I know that my wife's really dead, but as long as I have this ring, she's not actually dead. That sort of thing. One of my favorite, most humorous examples from Zizek is the time he talked about watching a documentary about a neo-Nazi leader in Berlin. And the interviewer on the show asked him, "Why are you a neo-Nazi?" And he expected to hear this flood of racist, anti-Semitic stuff and stuff about the master race. Instead, the neo-Nazi leader said, "I'm a neo-Nazi because of the breakdown of paternal authority and diminishing social mobility." So in other words, he's talking about himself the way a sociologist is supposed to talk about him. And yet he's still a Nazi. And that's a related phenomenon, right? Because he thinks he knows why he's a neo-Nazi, and yet somehow that doesn't quite exhaust it. Somehow being able to diagnose the reasons for his own neo-Nazism doesn't allow him to give it up and move beyond it and say, oh, I'm just being formed by sociological causes. I should realize that and not be a puppet of social forces and make my own decision to be a good person and not a Nazi. So these are some of the ways the unconscious works. And Lacan, of course, is the figure, and it's easier for philosophers to get into Lacan than Freud, I think. I actually, for many years, couldn't stand reading Lacan, and I've always loved reading Freud, very powerful writer. What changed it for me was starting to read the Seminar instead of the Écrits, because Lacan's Écrits are actually a real pain to read. They're too compressed, they're a little pretentious. for me, reading the seminars, it's kind of like reading Heidegger's lecture courses. They're addressed to the right sort of audience that any intelligent reader can pick them up and understand them. So I've been working through Lacan's seminar volumes and have become hooked on them. It's what I spend almost all of my spare reading time, pleasure reading time on these days. And eventually I'll work on Lacan. I haven't done it yet. But of course, what Zizek does with Lacan is he combines him with German idealism. So he emphasizes even more the idealism that's already there in Lacan. The fact that the real isn't a real. It's just a trauma to the symbolic order. Something we can't quite comprehend in our symbolic order. And then, of course, that's emphasized when you combine it with German idealism. The way Zizek puts it is that Lacan is to Freud as Hegel is to Kant. So in other words, Kant and Freud were still in this naive position of thinking that there's a real outside of the psyche, whereas Hegel and Lacan overcame that. Hegel, by realizing that the thing in itself is, the noumenal is just a special case of the phenomenal, basically. And that it's not beyond us, it simply has to be passed through dialectical movement, and we eventually get beyond it. And in Lacan's case, the idea that the unconscious isn't something hidden, but it's simply the symbolic order itself. It's language. So this turns into a severe form of idealism. Okay, so what are the things, given that OOP is opposed to idealism in all ways, what can we still salvage from psychoanalysis? Well, there are a couple of things that I think are important. One is the triad of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real in Lacan, which I think links up with a couple of things in the history of philosophy, Spinoza, and also Latour's Modes of Existence project. When people talk about Spinoza, they often talk about him retrospectively from the standpoint of German idealism. So they say that Spinoza thinks there's the mind and the body. Yes, but they forget that for Spinoza, there are infinitely many attributes. We're able to know those two, of thought and extension, but there are an infinite number. So Spinoza already has this extremely vast cosmos by comparison with Hegel or other later figures. He's kind of pointing the way towards Kant in a way, in the sense of this gigantic, unmeasurable infinity that's outside of our awareness. And then in Latour, it turns into 15 modes. Although it's actually 14. One of those modes, double click, I would say is a false mode. But Latour thinks there are 14 different modes. And in Latour's case, where this cashes out especially is in his opposition to a monopoly of science on rational discourse. Because science for him comes from a confusion between two of the modes, reproduction and reference. But then you also have law, politics, and religion. So what Latour is trying to say is that law, politics, and religion cannot be judged by scientific modes of cognition. And he has the best case when it comes to law, because everyone agrees that law doesn't work in the same way as science, right? In law, a piece of evidence can be disqualified simply because it was mishandled or because it wasn't declared early enough to the defense. So you're not reaching a scientifically accurate decision in the case of a legal verdict. There are lots of things you have to do in the legal profession that are not at all what you do in the scientific profession. And Latour's written a whole book about this, The Making of the Law, which is fascinating. How do you decide whether or not to rule in somebody's favor? And the reason he lays so much emphasis on law is because even incredibly scientific people like Dawkins or Dennett, would probably have no problem with the fact that law doesn't work the same way that science does. It changes when you get to science and religion, though. When you get to religion, scientific people just want to say religion's a load of crap. It has nothing to tell us. Now, ironically, Latour, who's a practicing Catholic, in order to explain what he thinks religion is, makes actually what looks like a non-religious gesture. He has to say that religion isn't about a real God who actually exists outside of us in the real world. Religion is about the rituals and the assembly of the people who come together around the ritual and the processions and the ceremonies, which is basically not that different from what Durkheim, a critic of religion, says about religion. So even though Latour is a practicing Catholic, he doesn't really believe in an independent God that exists outside the mind. It's not a God that's posed on the same level as science, but against it. I think he has a very strong case when it comes to politics, though. Because in politics, you often get a lot of scientifically minded people saying, politics is so petty, right? People are just interested in power. Why don't we all just agree on the truth and do politics that way? Which is a serious misconception of what politics is about. You could say that politics is precisely where the question of what is true gets fought out. There are certain political conflicts where it's not clear who is right. My favorite example, since I lived in Egypt for 16 years, is the conflict over Nile water rights, which could lead to a huge war in Africa. For many years, Egypt's main enemy was Israel. They were fighting with Israel until Camp David in 1979, and even now there's a lot of hostility between the two countries. The real enemy of Egypt in the future is more likely to be Ethiopia or Sudan, especially Ethiopia, and that is because of the water rights situation. And if you start digging into it, it's not entirely clear who's right in that conflict. And that's what real political situations are made of. Yes, you get some very black and white cases like Hitler. Hitler had to be stopped. I see Ukraine as a black and white case. I think Putin has no grounds for doing what he's doing. I think Putin must be stopped. But most political issues aren't like that. Most political issues are in a kind of gray zone where the struggle is precisely about who has the truth and who doesn't. In the case of Egypt, Egypt has a treaty which gives them the percentage of Nile water rights that they want. So the treaty is on Egypt's side. The response from Sudan and Ethiopia and now South Sudan is that treaty was signed under British colonialism. We weren't exactly free to make our own decision. So that treaty needs to be reopened. And Egypt says, yes, but you guys have rain. We don't have any rain. And we're the most populous country in Africa. We need the water most. The sub-Saharan countries respond, yes, Egypt, but you are terribly inefficient at irrigating. You're wasting too much of this water. And Egypt responds, yes, but you're wasting a lot of water too. And now it's to the point where Ethiopia seems to be building a dam on the Nile with Israeli engineering assistance. And this could eventually trigger a war. I'm gonna have to move here because I just realized my computer is running out of battery. I have to move back to where the charger is, sorry. So that's the kind of politics that Latour enables us to think about. And one last thing about Latour and politics that I think is one of his great insights as a philosopher. Modern political theory, as you mentioned, Matt, in your lecture, is very human-centric, and that's true whether it's the left or the right. The left and the right are modern political movements, even though they both try to link themselves. The left tries to link itself to an ancient struggle for justice against power. The right tries to link itself to the ancient Greeks and Romans and their virtue. These are really both modern movements because they are idealist movements. Both the left and the right, as we know them, are theories about human nature, basically, right? If you're on the left, you probably think that humans are naturally good or at least improvable, and that bad society or bad rich people are stopping us from having the equality that we all want. And if you're on the right, you just reverse that. You think humans are by nature very dangerous. If you're on the right, you probably think of that insight as the source of most wisdom. You have to realize that humans are dangerous, and therefore we have to give up trying to get the best because it might lead to the worst. So communism in Russia led to the worst. The Egyptians wanted to get rid of Mubarak and the abusive police culture in Egypt, and they end up with al-Sisi, who's much more brutal than Mubarak ever was. So the right would give that example. And countless other examples like that you should just be content with order and content with what you have. Okay, now recently, David Graeber and David Wengrow have published this new book, The Dawn of Everything. It's supposed to be a new interpretation of human history. And I remember when Graeber was still alive, I read an article previewing this, and it sounded very exciting, right? That they're going to rethink all of human history. They're going to get beyond the Rousseau versus Hobbes deadlock of the modern left and right, the Rousseau versus Machiavelli deadlock. I'm partway through that book now, and I'm already a little disappointed. It has a lot of interesting stuff that we never think of, like stuff about indigenous cultures and their political contributions, and that's all wonderful. But what they end up doing is just offering a different theory of human nature in that book. They say, no, humans aren't naturally good or naturally evil. That's wrong. So I agree with them on that. What they say instead, though, is that humans are naturally creative. And so humans can invent new forms of society. And that's been a recent theme on the left, that capitalism has no imagination, and that's the problem with it. Frederick Jameson supposedly said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, which is actually a good insight. I'm not always sure that the left is more imaginative than capitalism. As I asked the late Mark Fisher once, is Frederick Jameson really more imaginative than Steve Jobs? Because, you could say Steve Jobs is a boring capitalist and he's exploiting workers in China and so forth. Yes, but he provided a lot of tools that did revolutionize daily life for us. And so I wouldn't be so quick to say that capitalism has no imagination. Yes, there are problems with capitalism, but I regret the idea that anti-capitalism has become a kind of pious dogma. Just like the debate over human nature, is it good or is it evil, has become a kind of pious dogma. I think the way to go on this is Latour's way, and to say that politics isn't really a question of human nature, because politics is interwoven massively with non-human entities. The example he and Shirley Strum gave when they studied baboons together, if you watch baboons, you'll find that they're even more social than we are, because they're always watching each other. They're always having to figure out what the pecking order is today, how has it changed from yesterday, which baboons are mating today, which baboon is getting the most food. And we like to think of ourselves cynically as being the same, right? That human life is just a rat race, it's a power struggle, we're all stabbing each other in the back, we all only care about ourselves. But that's not really true in the same way that it is for baboons. And one of the reasons we're able to do that is because we're a little more secure than baboons. And the reason we're secure is because of inanimate objects. So I wake up in the morning, I know what my job is, I know what my name is, I know my social security number, I know my address. People can't come in this apartment without my permission. People can't take my money out of the bank without my permission. I have a wedding ring proving that my wife is married to me. I have a driver's license. I have a car that's my car. No one else can drive it. So I wake up every day, except in periods of crisis, with a pretty good sense of who I am, what I'm able to do, what I'm not able to do, who is a threat to me, who is not a threat to me, who I can trust, who I can't trust, what privileges I have, what privileges I don't have. All of these things are things that we humans have and that stabilize us somewhat. And these are guaranteed by inanimate objects. Humans have been able to use inanimate objects as barriers from constant uncertainty and threats from the outside. As Latour humorously puts it, when I go into the post office to buy stamps, thank God the clerk doesn't start telling me about his lover's teeth. Right? That would be inappropriate for the guy to start making personal remarks. So I think political theory is more about inanimate objects. So we have to check the idea that it's all about we humans just need to be more imaginative. I wrote an article last year on Catherine Malabou's political critique of speculative realism, and I've talked to John about this a couple of times. I think John called it the null hypothesis of continental philosophy, that the outside world can't play any role whatsoever in politics, that it all has to be pure subjectivity, pure imagination. And so that's surprisingly the line Malabou takes in that article, is that we just need to be more imaginative and ignore the world, and we can invent a political future. And I would say, no, that's not what we need. We need to take reality into account, because no solution is going to make any sense unless reality is taken into account. And I'm gonna get up again and shut this window, because there's a construction zone next to me, and you're probably hearing it. I'm sorry about that too. Now the problem is, this kind of realism that I'm calling for has often been associated in the past with kind of too hardcore, brutal political realism. I'm speaking, for example, of geographical determinism, for instance. This idea that certain things happen because of geography, that Turkey and Greece will always be enemies because of geography, that the United States is able to act like an island imperialist power like England because Canada and Mexico have always been weaker than the United States, and so we don't need a large land army. So therefore the US can be this global naval power. Or that, actually Henry Kissinger, ironically, says geographically the United States and Iran are natural allies, and he thinks he's a political realist who says the US and Iran are destined to be friends again soon because geographically we are natural allies, and so on. So the geographical approach to history is one example of the kind of realism I'm calling for, although that usually gets drawn in on the side of, maybe not the conservative side, but certainly more on the conservative side than on the progressive side. Geographical determinism is considered a check on the idea that let's get all together and make peace. And so it's viewed with suspicion, but it has a grain of truth in it. Military thinkers have a bad reputation among philosophers, but often I am very impressed by military analyses of situations, because military officers have to take reality seriously. or they fail. And so in the United States, it was actually the US military that took global warming seriously almost as quickly as climate activists did. Because they know all of our naval bases around the world are going to flood. Military officers know you have to wait until the new moon to launch an attack so that it's dark. Things like this. Military officers have to take reality seriously in a way that philosophers don't always do. Because there are certain things that you just have to face as facts. And again, we see that as a sort of the grim side of human thoughts. And so it's not, people want to think of politics as being about liberating everyone, emancipating everyone, making everyone equal. When people say politics these days, that's what they mean in philosophy. They mean, how are we going to emancipate and make everyone equal? Which is an important part of politics, but it's not the only important part of politics. There are other political problems that have nothing to do with that. Anyway, I just bring this all up because it ties in with I think, the weaknesses of psychoanalysis and its difficulty in taking account of reality, which is ironic because Freud puts the reality principle in as one of the pillars of his philosophy. And also psychologically, Iman, you brought up Max Scheler, and I think Max Scheler is very important as someone who allows us to bring the object back in cases like love. I wrote about this in Dante's Broken Hammer, that Scheler is like Dante. He's a philosopher of love, not a philosopher of the subject. And love is about things outside of us. Against Lacan, who thinks we're kind of projecting our desires into objects. So that's something I think psychoanalysis can take from Scheler. I'll close with one last point here. People have been very patient already. And that is about the incredibly poor track record of philosophy in shedding light on the human-animal-plant divisions. To go through the history of philosophy, and we're talking about great philosophers here, it doesn't really get past common sense most of the time. So in Aristotle's On the Soul, which is a great book, you've got plants, you've got animals, and you've got humans, which is kind of a commonsensical division. Thomas Aquinas expands that slightly by saying there's two kinds of animals, those that can move and those that can't. So we think of animals that can move usually, but then there are shellfish, which can't, many of them at least can't move, and yet they can perceive. And in Descartes, it takes on its most brutal form, where you've got humans and everything else is just a machine. So you can torture a monkey with a knife and it screams and it doesn't really matter because a monkey is just a machine. You've got Heidegger, who just divides between stones, animals, and humans. Doesn't even really talk about plants. And then you've got Meillassoux, who goes back to something similar, matter, plants, animals, thoughts, and then you've got maybe the virtual God who could come someday. These are fairly commonsensical distinctions. There's no real philosophical argument given for why the division should be at exactly those points. So why not at mammals, or why not at vertebrates? Or Helmut Plessner, who's kind of follower of Scheler, rough contemporary of Heidegger, who I've been reading more of lately, thinks that the jump between single-cell and multi-celled life is the big jump. And he's got a great case there because single-celled life is all that existed for 1 billion years. 1 billion years, which shows that the jump to multicellular life must have been a kind of freak, a real fluke. And Lynn Margulis thinks this too. Since otherwise it would have happened much earlier. It shouldn't have taken 1 billion years if multicellular life is something we could expect to easily happen once you have single-cell life. So that may have been the most important thing that ever happened for life, is the jump to multicellular organisms. And so we need a new kind of philosophical approach to demarcating these different kinds of entity. I call it punctuating. I'm borrowing that term from punctuated equilibrium from Eldridge and Gould's theory that evolution happens in jumps rather than gradually. So what are the real punctuations? And the tendency is to just let science tell us. And Ray Brassier has made this critique of object-oriented ontology. He said we should just listen to ethology and cognitive psychology to tell us the difference between an ant and a human. The problem with that is, according to Plessner, is that the sciences are always going to be sciences of qualities, right? They're going to be looking at attributes. It's going to take a Humean approach and say, humans have the following qualities, primates only have the following qualities, dogs have the following qualities. And that can never be a philosophical approach, because because philosophy always has to go in some sense beyond bundles of qualities and talk about the being of things. What is the correct approach to that? I don't know. I've been working on that lately, and I haven't made a whole lot of progress yet. But I hate it when people make predictions for philosophy, because predictions in philosophy are usually just projections of what they think right now. But if I had to make a prediction for 21st century philosophy, it's going to be that a lot of the progress is going to happen on the front of human and animal differences between different kinds of animals. Something that Derrida is good at, the fact that you shouldn't be lumping animals all into one category. You've got dolphins, and then you've got viruses, which are kind of borderline life forms. You're going to say that you're going to say the difference between a cockroach and a dolphin is nothing, but then suddenly the dolphin to the human, whoa, what a huge difference. It seems implausible somehow. So I think something's going to happen philosophically with that over the next 100 years, and that's what's going to drive us into a period where current philosophy looks a little primitive by comparison. I mean, great former philosophy is never really primitive. But why is it that contemporary philosophers never really go back to before Kant and Hume? I see Hume and Kant as being the dawn of contemporary philosophy, in the sense that you can be a literal Humean or a literal Kantian and be a philosophy professor, and no one's going to laugh at you. If you are literally Spinozist or literally Leibnizian and a philosophy professor, people are going to make fun of you behind your back. Or even if you're literally a Thomist and not in a Catholic university, people are going to make fun of you behind your back. Plato and Aristotle, maybe not so much, but Hume and Kant are when contemporary philosophy really started in terms of what is socially acceptable for philosophers to believe. Yeah, I think a similar thing is going to happen around the human-animal-plant distinction. And look at how many books there already are on plants in philosophy, on animals in philosophy. Something's happening, and maybe the canonical breakthrough hasn't happened yet, but we're building up to it, I think. So that's another thing I wanted to throw in there with respect to psychology. And then I'll stop there and let others speak. But thank you again, Iman. And again, it was totally easy to follow, very organized. The English was perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Graham.
Thank you so much.
Niki and Jon, if you two want to chime in.
Yeah, I don't know who wants to go first. Jon, do you want to go first, or shall I? As you wish. Oh, I think your mic must be off, Jon.
Yeah. Jon, we cannot hear you. I'm not sure if you're talking.
Niki, maybe you should start while Jon works on
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. There are two particular things I disagreed with you on, Iman, and that is that you don't have good English. That's definitely not the case, and that your talk was boring. It was actually one of the more exciting talks I've been to recently. So well done on that. It was really very interesting. What you know, you might know about this essay Graham had written a few years ago now, called Time, Space, Essence, and Eidos. Or was it Space? No, Time, Space, Essence, and Eidos. And on the 15th page of that essay, he writes this. I can actually read it. He says that imagining what it is like, talking about a non-human psyche, basically, without falsely ascribing human emotional or intellectual features to atoms is difficult. But it could easily become the topic of a philosophical discipline called speculative psychology, which would try to probe towards what is like not only to be a bat, or my mother, or Martin Heidegger, but also an atom, a grain of dust, an army, the excellent corporation, or France. Now, what is interesting about your talk especially is that basically this is the first stage of this step towards a cognitive psychology, which is in some way also what Jon and I are kind of trying to move towards in this book, which Graham mentioned earlier on panpsychism. And what I like, especially about this, I was listening to Peter Singer speak a couple of days ago. As I told Erfan earlier on, he was in Malta, for a couple of days. It's really quite surreal to see these big figures. And he was talking about how he's against it, but he was talking about how we generally tend to how humans have for thousands of years been obsessed with trying to delineate the distinction between humans and everything else. This is what Graham had called ontotaxonomy in his Dante book. And what I find fascinating about your talk is that it takes the opposite approach, in the sense that it begins with the object, and then sees the psyche as a product of object relations more generally. So this is especially interesting. And I was especially also interested in your mention of Andy Clark, because I don't know if Graham remembers this, but I had once spoken to him by email about the possibility of drawing parallels. I don't know if you remember this, Graham, about the possibility of drawing parallels between Andy Clark's extended mind hypothesis and object-oriented ontology, because there must be parallels. And it's what's interesting about Andy Clark as well is that not all cases of tool use, for example, are cases of extended cognition. Only particular situations are. So anyway, that's another very interesting point. I was interested in. There are two things. I won't keep you guys for too long, but there are two things I'm especially interested in. One particular upshot of this, or one particular thing which I've thought about in relation to your talk, is that perhaps it would be interesting to rehabilitate in OOO a concept which was used by Graham in 2005 in Guerrilla Metaphysics, but I'm not sure it makes too much of an appearance after that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Graham, but it's the concept of style, which is a really interesting concept because the thing about the style is that is this kind of this idea that every object's uniqueness is manifested in its style, and in a sense, if I'm not mistaken, in that book specifically, you equate the object with style in some sense. So that might be one interesting thing to look at to further your analysis of object-oriented psychology. The second thing, I've been thinking about the relation between psychologism and panpsychism. I'm not sure. I tend to think that OOO, it's a complex issue, and as I said, we're attempting to uncover the complexities of this, but I think that OOO would make a comfortable fit with panpsychism, but only if we understand panpsychism in specific ways, in the way that I described in the beginning in relation to your talk, Iman, in the sense that we can start by looking at the psyche of every object understood in general, and then move on to the human eventually. And in that sense, because very often people, the problem with panpsychism is the ascription of all to human qualities to non-human objects. And so you get people trying to undermine, for example, OOO by saying, "Oh, but my toaster can think," or something like this. Although, of course, this is not what panpsychism means. And I think your object-oriented psychology also indirectly makes a case for panpsychism in OOO by starting with the psyche as a feature of the object, then moving to the human as a result. So exactly, I haven't too many points to add to what you've already said, because I think it's a fantastic job, and I really wish to see this developed, especially in writing, because it would be interesting to analyze it, more slowly and absorb what you've said. It's really very interesting stuff. Well done, Iman.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Niki. Jon?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so I feel like crud, but your talk and Graham Harman was very energizing, so I also feel great. So it's a strange phenomenology. Hopefully I can make sense. I have just one thing I think might be interesting about panpsychism. The two things that I thought while you were talking, but I'm really excited about your project. I think it's wonderful. I'm really excited to read what you've got. On panpsychism, really quick, I think historically, weirdly, there are sort of two leaps to it. The panpsychism controversy in German idealism was the Spinoza controversy, and that ties more towards an epistemic problem of how we can have knowledge of the external world or of reality, and sort of leads up to the Hegelian idea of thinking equals being, which is really more of a form of idealism, as Graham put it. In the post-Cartesian assumption, you've got this problem with the mind-body problem, and the panpsychism is with David Chalmers' analytic philosophy is a solution to that. So one thing I'm hoping to explore more is Niki, and I've worked through this, is I think that Harman has a really interesting take on thinking equals being, where he could get a kind of panpsychism that's not idealism. And this is going to sound a little more Zizek'ian, but when Mayhew accuses Graham of being a subjectualist, it's this kind of panpsychism through German idealism, that you're describing the external world as being too human-like. And the reason that is because Graham starts with Heidegger and Husserl's phenomenology, and the sort of one read of how that's a speculative move is that the relationship between a subject and an object, as Husserl and Heidegger articulate it in two different ways. Harman says, or the reading of Harman, that, we too are things in the world. Maybe this relationship is characteristic of any two things in the world. So you get withdrawal in the Heidegger book. You get a sensual realm between any two objects. And so that's when someone like Mayhew comes in and says, oh, you're just a subjectualist. And that's a kind of panpsychism of the German idealism sort. But the irony is there's this Zizek'ian kind of maneuver there that what's getting externalized is withdrawal. So there's the kind of unknowability that you theorize with your account of love, which I think is wonderful. So it's not really subjectualism because what's being externalized is the unknowability of the object and how objects are unknowable for each other. So that's something Niki and I are thinking about and hoping to develop a set of this. We're going to have a set of questions for Graham, so that was a little bit of a heads up. But I think in terms of now getting to your presentation, I really love the account of love and how that ties to your account of mental health and how that is articulated in the OOO framework. And I just have sort of 2 points on that, I think. It occurs to me that the sort of standard modes of explanation in cognitive psychology and cognitive science, by Iman's account, can be analyzed as being evidence of sickness. So the first thing, if you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what American psychologists use, basically, if you want somebody's insurance company to cover their mental health treatment, the therapist has to have a number in the DSM. And this leads to a lot of issues where we're medicalizing things that maybe aren't normative issues. So excessive grief is now in the 5th edition of the DSM. If someone you love dies, you should be excessively sad. But if you want to get treatment for that, they have to write the number that says you've got a disorder. Okay, if you look at the beginning of the DSM, the latest one, you realize they don't know what they're talking about. They define mental health clearly as functioning effectively in your society. Right? But that's what could be sicker than that. What if your society is crazy You know, the craziest people are the healthiest ones. And every society is crazy. So you've got no room to say that a society is sick or that somebody that's functioning well in a society is unhealthy. And so that's a key example of overmining, scientific overmining that robs it of any normative significance. When we're talking, Young writes about this, the notion of health with physical health, they're saying it's a normative, thing. So that's the first thing where I really like your approach. I think is much better for clinical psychology. The second thing that I thought of while you're talking, and this is get a little caffeine to power up. I think there's a really strong connection when I start to think of what you're saying and clinical psychology. The sense that in philosophy of mind, analytic philosophy of mind, there's this position called methodological solipsism. This relates to Clark and people, but we could. But it really is just a certain aspect of Hume that's caught on, that everyone takes as common sense. And that's that human beings are just belief desire machines. And so almost all cognitive science, cognitive psychology, that's the sort of root assumption that we're just these belief desire machines. And that that's reflected in clinical psychology really heavily. We're just trying to get you where your desires are sort of balanced and you're, have a certain amount of pleasure that doesn't give you distress. But there's a real solipsism there. Now in Japan, I need to find the name of this. There's a school of therapy where the kind of therapy you get in cognitive behavioral therapy and Freudianism, you're taught to sort of look into your own navel and once you understand the causes of your distress, that's going to magically heal you somehow. And this form of therapy in Japan, that's thought to be like you're making the problem worse. Because your problem was that you were so self-centered. And they teach people hobbies. You really have to do it. You've got to practice your whatever, or gardening or whatever it is, to learn to love something and get a sense of meditative calm through that love. There's an implicit psychological egoism, I think, in a lot of clinical psychology. And while you're talking, I had this idea that if you look at the philosophy behind psychological egoism, the arguments for it are very similar to the arguments for correlationism, arguably exactly the same. So the correlationist, all you can really know about is, but I'm gonna botch this a little bit. So the Fichtean idea, which comes from Berkeley, is try to imagine something that's unimaginable. You can't do it. So you do it. So that's how Berkeley gets everything's knowable. The kind of idealism that everything that we can talk about has to be such that we can already talk about it. And that's what the problem that Macy raises in after finitude. And the psychological ego is to it too. We had a job candidate who was doing this sort of Humean analytic philosophy where everything's desires and beliefs and desires and second order desires about desires. And one of my students asked him, like, what about the up of the perverse? We just do the thing we don't want to do. Don't people all the time do things that on reflection they would much rather they didn't do? Isn't that the problem? And he was like, no, because if you're doing it, you really do desire it. That's the same move the correlationist makes. So I think it'd be interesting to think about the arguments for psychological egoism, how that kind of egoism is endemic in clinical practice, and how that relates to various moves about the critique of correlationism, and what different speculative realists and Graham says about that argument for correlationism. Finally, I think this ties to Buddhism in a really important way, and I really resonated when you brought in the Japanese stuff. But there's so enlightenment is being non-attached. What is that? It's being non-averse. One of the major paradoxes in Buddhism is that if you're attached to non-attachment, you're still attached. Right? And so there's supposed to be a way of being in the world that's non-attached, but not attached to non-attachment. And I think the argument that, like, oh, you're just attached to non-attachment or you can't get out of that, that's the same kind of argument that the ethical egoist is saying. Well, you did it, you must really desire it, so you're really just this belief desire machine after all. I think it's the same kind of argument that the correlationist makes, that well, it must be knowable to you after all because you're talking about it. So that's something I want to, as I read your stuff, I hope that would, I want on my own think about clinical psychology and the critique of correlationism and how that fits with, and I just want to reiterate, I really, really like the idea of love. It's another little tangent. You get a Kantian sort of ethics where everything's based on autonomy. But I think it's very important to differentiate what you're doing from the Kantian view of autonomy. The liberal Kantian view is really, the Huey Long wrote this song called Every Man a King. He was the sort of dictator of Louisiana years ago. And so, the liberal tradition is, it's really bad to have somebody's foot on your neck. That sucks. So you slowly take the feet off the neck, but then the white male can still have the neck on the colonies, still have the foot on the neck of the white. So then it's the property owner, the bourgeois property owner won't have the king's foot on his neck. You slowly expand this, maybe women can vote or whatever, slowly expand it. But the picture is still, this is the Buddhist critique, it's still the idea of the autonomous subject. And the critique is that you get to have your boot on your own neck. The only boot on your neck is your own. That's the Kantian model of autonomy from a Buddhist perspective that you would critique. What I really loved about what you're saying about love, and coming out of Graham's work, is this this respect and affirmation of the unknowability of the other, or the uncontrollability. It's this grasping control of the other. The affirmation and respect of that doesn't force you to have this sort of the kind of view about the self that we get from Kant. But I think it gets right what's right about the tradition of autonomy. So I'm just really excited about your work, and I want to read it when I've got it. And the stuff about tying it to the critique of relationism is something I want to think about much more deeply. So thank you. It was great.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much. Iman, any comments on the ideas that brought up by Jon, Niki, and Graham?
These very, very interesting points. I wrote them down, all of them, and I should again thank Jon for being here despite being ill a bit. That's all. I have nothing else to say. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Anybody else, if they have anything to add, I want to invite Mike Ardoline if he wants to talk as well, and as another guest speaker maybe.
Yeah, sure. First, I want to echo what everyone else said, which is this was a great talk. Yeah, your English is great. It was not boring at all. It's a very interesting project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where it's going. In fact, I have kind of I have a comment/question about where it's going and more particular practice, because I'm a little worried about the presentation as given being itself a bit too anthropocentric in focusing on the ways in which we have our relations to objects as a form of either something like an attachment in the Buddhist sense, or just as being like our somewhat willful relation with other things or other objects. And so what I mean by that is you had that, and if I missed this when I stepped away for a few minutes, my apologies, but you had the diagram of love at the top, exhaustion, and then pathological withdrawal, right? And the psychological view you put forward is, there's some relationship between cultivating this proper sense of love and this proper comportment to the world that you're calling love and psychological health. Is that right so far? So I guess what I was interested in is if that's, well, I'm interested to see where it goes and where my partial critique of this being too anthropocentric, if we stop there, is that one of the things that I really like about Graham's work and object-oriented philosophy in general is the way it opens up this looking at particular object interactions. And looking at that in psychology is, I'll give two examples. One's a personal. So you see, this is my home office. It's the first time I have a home office to have my books and everything. And I was very excited for it. So I put all my stuff in here, did that. And then for the first 3 or 4 months, I just didn't touch it.
You know, my windows, the sun was too bright in the morning, and there's no light in this room at night, so there was no time where I could like work in here without it hurting my eyes or it being too dark to actually like read a book. And so I ended up not working in here for a few months, and I ended up getting like not clinically depressed, but just sad that I wasn't getting the work done. I wasn't doing it the way I wanted. And the thing that I changed wasn't that I cultivated a sort of love for the room or something. I bought some blinds and I put a lamp in. And just introducing new objects to the situation alleviated the psychological difficulties I was having. And it strikes me that that's a path that's open up if you take the object-oriented, ontological approach to look at its effects on the human mind. That is parallel to or not encompassed by this form of relation, of whether it's love, pathological withdrawal, or exhaustion. And the second one I'll do so that's the positive example. Here's maybe the positive in the sense of adding objects to a situation. And maybe here's the negative example, and it's negative in the sense of taking objects away from the situation. You brought up the question, should we love our oppressor? And I think you're right. I think that is an important challenge for your position to deal with. And I was thinking something like, Fanon's work on psychology, right? And so he looks at the psychological damage done by oppressors of colonial subjects. And Fanon, I think, has a response you can use, which is, okay, the way to change the psychological damage done by the oppressor is not about a new relation or getting the right relation between oppressor and oppressed. It's about removing a particular object from this equation, that being the oppressor. Right? And if you get rid of that, if you get rid of the oppressor, or the structure that oppressor is like making possible, you will see, maybe not immediate, but with a certain time lag, you will see the improvement of mental health of the people who were formerly colonized and oppressed, without them changing the way they related to some set of objects. And so related specifically in the form of that triangle of relations you put up. And so, yeah, if I can offer a critique or a question of like where I'm interested to see where it's going, I'm interested to see where it's going in the effects that objects have outside of any human intentional comportment, and on looked at like experiments with like particular object interactions, rather than the relations between the general ontological category of objects.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. As the last comments or words, Graham, Niki, Jon, if you want to say the last words, since we were here for around 2.5 hours, the marathon of object-oriented psychology, I would say. Graham, can you hear me?
Yeah, all I have to say is that I'm looking forward to seeing all this in print maybe someday, and reading it. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Niki. Jon and Graham, if you have any last words.
I just want to reiterate what Niki said. I really look forward to reading this, and I also thought your English was lovely, and it was not in the least boring. And I don't feel well right now, so I'm a difficult crowd. So you please do a very difficult crowd. It was great. Thank you.
My thought is that I'd like to have more of these events. I don't want this to be the last one. It was very pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful chance to meet people from different parts of the world, as well as some old friends. And it's my first time meeting Mark Ardoline, too. Nice to see you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you all for joining and accepting my invitation. Thanks for being so generous. Thanks for spending the time with us as the three Iranians are trying to revive the soul of Persian speculation in Iran, hopefully in philosophy and continental philosophy. And thank you all for being with us. I think that's it. We can wrap it up. Thank you so much.